In June of 1816, snow fell on New England farmland that should have been green with growing corn. In July, killing frosts destroyed standing corn across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. In August, families across the northeastern United States were rationing food they had expected to harvest in October. Farmers across New England called it 1800 and froze to death. That was not a figure of speech. It was a description of what the year felt like from inside it. The cause of what happened in 1816 was 10,000 miles away from the farms of Vermont, and it had occurred a full year before the cold arrived. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora, a volcanic peak on the island of Sumbawa in present-day Indonesia, erupted in what remains the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The eruption of Tambora ejected an estimated 150 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, roughly 30 times the volume of material produced by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. Among the material ejected was an enormous quantity of sulfur dioxide, a gas that, once it reaches the stratosphere, reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosol particles. Sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere scatter incoming solar radiation, reflecting sunlight back into space before it can reach the Earth's surface. The larger the aerosol load, the greater the reduction in solar energy reaching the ground. Clive Oppenheimer, in his 2011 Cambridge University Press analysis of volcanic climate forcing, documented that the Tambora aerosol veil reduced global average surface temperatures by an estimated 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius for the period 1815 through 1817. At the global average, a reduction of 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius sounds modest, but global averages obscure regional extremes, and it was the regional extremes that destroyed the 1816 harvest. NOAA historical climate records document that, across New England and eastern Canada in the summer of 1816, temperatures ran 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit below the historical average for June, July, and August, the 3 months that determine whether a northern crop survives or fails. To understand what 3 to 5 degrees below average means for a farmer, you need to understand what the northern growing season actually requires. Corn, the dominant food and feed crop across New England and the upper Midwest in the early 19th century, requires a frost-free growing season of approximately 100 to 120 days. With consistent daytime temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit for germination and above 70 degrees for productive growth. In Vermont and New Hampshire, the average frost-free growing season in the early 19th century ran from approximately late May to mid-September, roughly 110 to 120 days. That margin was tight even in normal years. In 1816, that margin disappeared entirely. Vermont Historical Society records document killing frosts in every month of the growing season, including June 6, July 9th, and August 21st. The June 6th frost killed the first planting of corn across much of Vermont and western New Hampshire. Farmers who had the seed replanted. The July 9th frost killed the second planting. Those who still had seed replanted a third time. The August 21st frost killed what little had managed to grow. 3 plantings, 3 losses. The seed corn that farm families had saved through the winter for planting, the capital of the entire farming operation, was gone. It was not only corn. Wheat harvests across New England ran 50 to 75% below normal in 1816, according to County Agricultural Society reports documented in the Vermont Historical Society records. Hay production, critical for livestock overwintering, was similarly reduced. Livestock that could not be fed through a New England winter without adequate hay stores faced one of 2 fates: early slaughter to avoid starvation, or starvation itself. Both outcomes depleted the breeding stock that farms depended on for future seasons. Food prices across New England responded accordingly. Corn prices, documented in Boston merchant records from 1816, rose by approximately 200% between spring and fall, driven by the combination of failed local harvests and disrupted supply from southern states which were also affected by the cold. The southern states were not immune. Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia all experienced below normal temperatures in the summer of 1816, though the effects were less severe than in New England due to the longer baseline growing season. The effects were global. In Europe, particularly France, Germany, and Switzerland, the 1816 harvest failure triggered food riots documented in government records of the period. In China, the Yunnan province experienced crop failures linked to the same aerosol cooling. In India, the disruption of the monsoon pattern contributed to a cholera outbreak that spread globally. Gillen Darcy Wood, in his 2014 Princeton University Press account of Tambora's global consequences, documents the chain of disruptions across 3 continents, tracing every one of them back to the aerosol veil from a single volcanic event on a small island in the Indonesian archipelago. Back to America, and to the specific question that is most relevant for anyone thinking about farming, food security, or land resilience today. What did the farmers who survived 1816 actually do? The historical record, town records, farm diaries, agricultural society reports, and church records from 1816 and 1817 document several distinct patterns of response. Each one represents a practical adaptation that is still relevant to anyone farming in a short season or climate-variable environment today. The first documented adaptation: rapid crop substitution. When corn plantings failed in June, farmers who had access to alternative seed stocks turned immediately to cold-hardy crops with shorter growing seasons. Turnips, which can germinate in soil temperatures as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit and reach harvest in 60 days, were planted across failed cornfields through June and July. Vermont Historical Society records note that turnip plantings in the summer of 1816 were documented across multiple counties at scales far exceeding normal practice, a measurable departure from typical planting patterns that confirms the substitution was widespread and deliberate. Winter rye, a grain crop tolerant of cold and frost, capable of germinating in temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit, was planted on failed cornfields through August, where the soil could still support a late-season harvest before the first hard autumn frost. Buckwheat, with a growing period of only 70 to 75 days and strong cold tolerance, was also documented as a late-season substitute in western New England and upstate New York farm records from 1816. It could be planted in July and still reach harvest before October frosts. The lesson embedded in this pattern: crop diversity across a farm, holding seed stocks for multiple species with different temperature tolerances and growing season lengths, provides resilience that no single crop can offer. A farm growing only corn in 1816 had no options when the corn failed. A farm growing corn, rye, oats, turnips, and buckwheat had 4 fallback positions and the ability to redirect planting effort toward whatever the season would still support. The second documented adaptation: aggressive seed saving and regional seed sharing. After 3 failed corn plantings had exhausted most families' seed corn reserves, the seed that remained became the most valuable commodity on any New England farm. Town records from 1816 and 1817 document instances of seed corn being traded, sold, and shared between neighbors at prices that reflected its scarcity. Agricultural Society records from Vermont and New Hampshire document formal efforts to redistribute seed stocks across regions, matching farmers who had surplus seed from crops that had partially survived with farmers in areas where seed stocks had been entirely exhausted. This community seed network, informal by modern standards, but systematic within its time, preserved the genetic diversity of locally adapted crop varieties that had been developed over generations of northern farming. Many of the heirloom corn and grain varieties that northern seed-saving organizations catalog today trace their documented lineage through the farms that survived 1816, preserved precisely because of the deliberate seed-saving that the crisis forced. The third documented adaptation: geographic migration as agricultural response. C. Edward Skene, in his 2003 University Press of Kentucky account of the 1816 crisis in America. documents a measurable surge in westward migration from New England following the 1816 failure, families leaving thin-soiled Vermont hillsides for the richer, longer-season farmland of Ohio, Indiana, and western New York. Vermont's population, which had grown steadily since statehood in 1791, actually declined in the years following 1816, a demographic contraction directly traceable in census records to the outmigration that the agricultural crisis accelerated. The families who stayed in New England adapted their farming systems to the reality that had been forced upon them: shorter season crops, more diverse plantings, less dependence on a single grain. The fourth documented adaptation, accelerated adoption of cold hardy variety selection. The corn varieties that partially survived the 1816 frosts, producing at least something despite the cold, were identified, noted, and their seeds saved with particular care. Agricultural Society records from Vermont and New Hampshire document explicit discussions of which corn varieties had shown the greatest cold tolerance in the 1816 season. This was empirical plant breeding, farmers selecting for cold tolerance based on direct observation of performance under stress, without the formal genetics framework that would not arrive until the 20th century. The method was imprecise by modern standards. The direction was correct. The 8-row flint corn varieties, documented in northern New England farm records through the 1820s, shorter statured, earlier maturing, more cold-tolerant than the southern dent corn varieties, reflect the cumulative selection pressure that 1816 and subsequent cold seasons applied to the northern seed stock. Those flint corn varieties, some of which survive today as heirloom seed stock, are living documentation of what 1816 forced northern farmers to select for. They are shorter. They mature earlier. They tolerate cold better than any corn variety bred for warm climate yield. Now, what does the record of 1816 actually mean for someone farming or gardening today? The eruption of Tambora is not a repeatable lesson. No one is expecting another event of that magnitude in the near term. But the vulnerabilities that 1816 exposed are permanent features of farming in any variable climate. The first practical lesson from 1816: know your frost dates and build margin into your planting calendar. The farmers who survived 1816 with the most options were those who had planted early enough that their crops had the maximum possible head start before the cold arrived, and who replanted quickly when the first plantings failed. NOAA frost date records for your specific location, available through the NOAA Climate Data online portal, give you the historical average last spring frost date and first fall frost date for your region. Those are not guarantees, they are averages. 1816 is the proof of what the outliers look like. Build margin. If your average last frost date is May 15th, plan your planting for crops that could survive a frost on May 25th. If your first fall frost average is October 1st, choose varieties that complete their season by September 15th. That margin is what 1816 consumed, and its absence is what destroyed the harvest. The second practical lesson: maintain seed diversity, including cold hardy varieties of your primary crops. Every crop species includes varieties with different temperature tolerances and season lengths. For corn, short-season flint varieties like Bloody Butcher, Pencil Cob, or Dakota Black mature in 80 to 90 days rather than 100 to 120, giving you a 20 to 30-day buffer in a difficult season. For beans, bush varieties that mature in 50 to 55 days versus pole varieties that require 60 to 70 days. For squash, acorn and delicata mature in 80 to 85 days. Hubbard varieties require 100 days or more. Knowing the days to maturity for every crop in your planting list is not just useful information. In a compressed season, it is the difference between a harvest and a failure. The third practical lesson: protect what you can, when you can. The 1816 farmers had limited frost protection tools. The most widely documented was the cold frame, a low box typically built from stone, brick, or timber, with a glazed or oiled paper cover that admitted light while trapping ground heat. Cold frames concentrate solar heat during the day and hold it overnight, creating a microclimate inside that can be 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the ambient air. On a night when ambient temperature drops to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold frame interior may remain above the 32-degree freezing threshold. In 1816, farmers who had cold frames in use, primarily for starting seedlings earlier in spring, found them suddenly critical as season extension and frost protection tools through the summer months. New Hampshire Agricultural Society records note that cold frame construction increased markedly in the years following 1816. Modern equivalents, floating row covers, low tunnels, season extension fabric, are more effective than anything available in 1816. They are also inexpensive and rapidly deployable. The principle is identical. Create a boundary between the plant and the ambient air that traps ground heat. The fourth practical lesson, embedded in the 1816 record, is the most fundamental. No single crop, no single strategy, and no single season tells the complete story of a farm resilience. The farms that navigated 1816 with the least loss were those that had, by practice or by luck, built redundancy into their systems, multiple crops, stored seed reserves, cold frames, knowledge of alternative species, and connections to neighbors who could share what one farm lacked. The farms that lost everything, the seed, the livestock, the family's food supply for the coming winter, were almost uniformly those dependent on a single crop with no fallback position. The pattern repeats throughout agricultural history, from the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, where dependence on a single variety of a single crop produced catastrophic consequences when that variety succumbed to blight, to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, where monoculture wheat left the plain soil without the biological diversity to survive drought. The lesson of 1816 is not that volcanic eruptions are predictable or preventable. The lesson is that a farm, any farm, that is built around diversity, stored reserves, and flexible response capacity is more likely to find a path through a bad year than one that is not. Mount Tambora erupted again in 1967, a minor event with no significant climate forcing. It remains an active volcano. The stratospheric aerosol mechanism that caused 1816 is documented physics, not historical anomaly. Events of Tambora's 1815 magnitude have occurred before in geological history and will occur again. That is not a prediction. It is a geological statement. The practical response to it is not fear. It is preparation. And the preparation that 1816 points toward is the same preparation that makes any farm more resilient in any difficult year: diversity, stored reserves, and knowledge of alternatives. That's the real story of 1816, documented in town records, farm diaries, agricultural society reports, and the census data that recorded who stayed and who left. It is a story about what a single season can take from a farm, and about what the farms that survived had built that the others had not. The farms that survived had diversity. They had stored seed. They had cold frames and alternative crops and neighbors they could turn to. They had, in other words, built for resilience before they needed it. That is what we mean by traditional farming wisdom, not nostalgia for a harder time, but the accumulated knowledge of what actually works when the season does not cooperate. If this kind of documented agricultural history is what you come here for, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer. We cover farming history, soil science, and homestead skills, all with verified sources and no dramatization. In the comments, tell us, does your region still have farming traditions that trace back to the hard lessons of years like 1816? Or do you grow any of the short-season heirloom varieties that survived that year? We genuinely like to know. The lesson here isn't nostalgia. It is that the farms that survived 1816 had already done the work before the year gave them reason to be grateful for it. We'll see you in the next one.